name is Victor Okafor. I'm the department head of the Department of Africology and African American Studies. As I welcome you to this 5th edition of non-partisan panel discussion series, let me use this opportunity to share an important announcement with you. Effective from this winter semester, our department has assumed a new name. We are now known as the Department of Africology and African American Studies. This name change was meant to reflect two key factors. One is our aspiration for instructional and research coverage of a broader scope of the historical and contemporary circumstances of the global African world. And two is the current scope of our course contents, our scholarly inquiries and service undertakings, which reach beyond the geographical confines of African descendants in the United States. It's important to note that this name change is accompanied by a substantial restructuring of the course requirements for a major and minor in African American Studies. One of the key changes to the major is that henceforth, a student must complete an internship in order to obtain an undergraduate degree in African American Studies. Thus, on behalf of the Department of Africology and African American Studies, I welcome you warmly to this event. As you know, we are here today to witness an expert panel discussion series that we've been running since the election of Barack Obama as President of the United States in 2008. As all of us gathered here today would most probably agree, Obama's emergence and re-election as President of the United States represented watershed moments in not only African American history, but also in American and global history of humanity in general. Thus, those watershed moments ought to be recounted during this month of February each year that this nation has come to embrace as a special period of stock-taking, a time for recounting the triumphs and challenges of African American life and culture in this society. As you must have noticed, we have provided refreshments for you. Please feel free to get up and help yourselves with the refreshments as the program transpires. Although it promises to be exciting, we do ask for your patience because this 3-hour program consists of 2 main parts, a keynote and a follow-up panel discussion. As a respondent, Professor Ronald Woods will wrap up the panel discussion. Students, please be sure to complete and return the LBC credit form to the welcome table that is outside. At this point in time, I have the honor to invite the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Professor Thomas Venner, to say some words of welcome.
Thank you very much, Victor. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this very important discussion. It's a pleasure to see you all here today, and my greetings also to our distinguished panel. This presentation is part of a series of annual discussions that the Department of Africology African American Studies has created around topics of race, diversity, politics, and other issues of critical concern to us as members of a diverse academic community and as citizens of a dynamic nation. Eastern Michigan University is an institution that has been recognized nationally and applauded for its efforts to diversify the student body, which approaches 30% African American, and I'm proud of that recognition. But I am concerned about resting on such a distinction, as if having a diverse student body in and of itself would lead to necessarily better understanding. I personally believe that intellectual discourse of the sort that we will have here today is a key. It is serious work, I know, and can begin in an afternoon, but must build over time. So I want to commend and express my appreciation to the faculty of the Department of Africology and African American Studies and its head, Dr. Victor Okafor, for their work putting this event together, and to each of you in this room today for your willingness to engage in this important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Venner. At this point, I also have the pleasure to invite the Provost and Vice President of Eastern Michigan University, Dr. Kim Sasho. She's going to, after her few words of welcome, she's also going to make an announcement about the winners of this year's student essay contest on Obama's presidency.
I want to add my welcome to everyone that's here, as well as the distinguished panel that we're going to have the opportunity to listen to and learn from. This is a very important event, and it's part of a very important event. And I want to echo the words of Dean Venner in terms of the pride that we take here at Eastern Michigan University in terms of the diversity of our campus, our students, our faculty, our staff, and our attempts to make it a highly inclusive environment for all of those people. I had the opportunity this past November to be in China on the day of the election. And in fact, I was with Dean Venner actually, and I landed in Hong Kong the morning of the election, went to my hotel, put my bags down, and went to I have to say, it was a bar. I went to a bar. That was an expat bar, so there was a lot of British and Americans that were in there, and I got to sit with a whole group of strangers and watch the election results come in. And the celebration when the election results were announced, this is on the BBC, was just a terrific experience to be sharing with people from all over the world. So it was a terrific experience for me. Part of the fact that we do these kind of events is, of course, in recognition of how important they are, as well as the fact that we're a university campus and we're focused on learning. It's something that we continue to do and we have a strong commitment to do. Part of it is, as I said, about students, and I have the opportunity now to be able to make 3 students happy, as I shared with everyone, to be able to announce the winners of the essay contest. They were asked to be able to write a 3-page essay on the topic, which is a critical assessment of the journey of the first African American president of the United States. The 3rd prize winner is Candace M. Would she come up, please? I just told Candace when she sat at my table, I had to turn the paper around because I didn't want her to see that she was one of the winners. Congratulations. The 2nd prize winner is Edward Patterson. Is Edward here? And our 1st prize winner is Alan J Raupp-Laverty. We have a round of applause for all the students. I unfortunately can't stay for the panel discussion I did last year, and it's my deep regret to do that. But again, I want to wish everybody welcome, and also our thanks to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Provost Sasho. At this point, I would like to invite Professor Ronald Woods to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Okafor, and thank you for each of you having made your way this afternoon to the program. Dr. Ravi Perry is a man in a hurry. This is not according to me, but according to his mother and his father, Dr. Ravi Perry, Dr. Ravi Perry. Born earlier than expected, he moved with rapidity and great accomplishment through his years as a elementary school student, middle school student, and high school student. And along the way, became a stellar high school miler and middle distance runner. He went on to the University of Michigan and graduated with honors in 3 years. From there, he was admitted to the political science program, the graduate program at Brown University, and set one of the fastest paces for navigating through the various steps of the doctoral journey there, receiving his PhD in 2009, just some 5 years after having graduated with his bachelor's degree. Now, I could go on to talk about the many things that Dr. Perry has done in the time since then. He has taught at Clark University as an assistant professor. He has written in the area of Black politics, African American mayors, urban politics, politics and race. He is very much sought out as a commentator in both the print media and the electronic media for his insight and for his analysis. He has been engaged in public service and civic responsibility in the greater community. He holds the distinction of being the first openly gay president of an NAACP chapter in the United States. His articles, his books, all of these are many. And he now finds himself at Mississippi State University, Starksville, Mississippi, where he is an assistant professor of political science and a Stennis Scholar in municipal governance. And on this 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and just a couple of days after the centennial recognition of the birth of Rosa Parks, we are very much reminded of the things that really bring Ravi Perry to us. Ravi is an individual, but Ravi, as each person on this panel would attest in their own right, is a representative of forces and movements. You see, just over half a century ago, a Ravi Perry could not have attended Mississippi State University. 60 years ago, and I get this by anecdote from several members of our greater Washtenaw community who are from Starksville, life was such that on a large farm owned by a Caucasian, there would be a ritual every Monday morning that would involve a black farmhand named Jake. Jake would go out to the field, have his hand on a plow, and there would be a mule. And the owner of the farm would come out and commence to beat Jake on his back. And he would say, using words that I won't put here, he won't get started unless he gets a good beating. Now there is the setting where Ravi Perry is now, but where history has brought us. The fact that he holds the Stennis Scholarship or Scholar in municipal governance is quite significant as well. For many will recall that 50 to 60 years ago, twin pillars of segregation in Mississippi, Senator John Stennis and Senator James O. Eastland, were simply typical of what we have seen in this country. And then lastly, particularly in the South, then lastly on this occasion of African American History Month, Ravi Perry represents a tradition. It's a tradition that was scripted even by the unlearned, the illiterate, and the unread, slaves who were freed 150 years ago. Scripted by Carter G. Woodson, W.E.B. Du Bois, and so many others. And scripted, as Ravi Perry would say, by his mentor, the late, just recently, the late Haynes Walton, whose book, When the Marching Stopped, sort of picks up where the lives and journeys of so many of us have begun. And so indeed, Ravi Perry is a man in a hurry. But more importantly, he is a man on a mission, and he understands that mission. A mission that's been scripted by history, a mission to give elucidation and some shaping to the public policy choices of our day and time. And I ask that we do all that we can to welcome to this podium Dr. Ravi Perry.
What Professor Woods neglected to mention was that he's one of the main reasons why I even have a PhD. He was one of my professors at the University of Michigan. He still shares his time there as he does here with the Department of Africology and African American Studies. And had it not been for his tutelage, I definitely would not be whatever I am today. So thank you so much, Professor Woods. I really appreciate that. I want to bring you greetings from a whole bunch of sources, but from at least from 70-degree weather. And so I have to get used to being cold again, and I'm not really fond of that. And so I hope I won't keep you long, but I do want to share some thoughts with you about this moment and this person whom we know who occupies 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And my thoughts are derived from the theme that I have decided on for today of what is it that we actually want? What do we want? What do we want? That's been a question that we, those of us who are Black particularly, the marginalized, those of us who are the other, we've asked that question from the very beginning. Well before somebody named Columbus claimed ownership of a land he called anew. Well before that, Blacks were the first to cry for what we wanted. No matter where our travels led us, we did so. Juan Guarida planted and harvested the first wheat crop of the New World in 1519. He boldly claimed also what he wanted. Estevanico claimed his right to inquire what he wanted as an explorer. He was a native Moroccan. He was the slave of Dorantes, and Estevanico was the first non-Indian to reach the Great Plains and what today is New Mexico. Boldly crying, of course, for him as well, what is it that we want in this new world? Nanga, a Congolese chief and king of the Moroccan Cimarrones, bought and sold as a slave Nanga's Palenque in Mexico. Once he arrived there, forced negotiations with Spanish slavers, resulting in the development of a free town called San Lorenzo de Negros, a free settlement for what we today call Black people. And these Black people did not let assumptions of what a Black person was to define their destiny. Instead, they demanded free settlement. They demanded rightful ownership. They demanded the right to be set free. And here in the United States, Black men and women from Africa were present long before these people called pilgrims landed on a place called Plymouth Rock. Blacks like Anthony Johnson, the patriarch of the first community of Negro property owners who was settled in Virginia in the early 1600s on the banks of the Pungoteague River, which is now Virginia Beach. But before this concept, as we now know as chattel slavery, came into existence, we did have, in fact, Black-led rebellions. We have Black-led rebellions, again, Black people crying out loud and clear for what they wanted. Some of them arrived as early as 1526 in a small town of what is now South Carolina near the Petty River, and they too rebelled, beginning the first known revolt of what would become American soil. Black people forced through indentured servitude to arrive in a land unknown knew the answer to the question of what it is we wanted. Their force was so powerful that white wannabe settlers actually sailed back across the Atlantic. Thus, and get this straight, everybody, and this is important for today, Black people became the first permanent immigrants to this land of the free, this land of opportunity, this English divorced city on a hill. These are just a few examples of historical record known to date concerning the arrival of Africans to this land of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Most of you know the date 1619. We were told in our elementary history books, and some of us might not have gotten this to college, but that's another commentary to another day. But we should have been told, hopefully, at some point, that it was 1619 that is the earliest possible example of what Black people could possibly want, because we didn't really exist in this country until then. That's what we were told. We were told that it was 1619 when Black people first arrived here as indentured servants on our eastern shores. Well, that's what we were told. But we weren't also told that it was 1619 when we had the first recorded example of representative government formed here in this country by the Virginia Company of London. And this company granted the few white so-called colonists that existed at the time, granted them the right to have elections for them of the freely elected other inhabitants in the Virginia soil. And they developed what would become known as the House of Burgesses. But history books does not record this story. History books starts a month later in 1619, and history books start when a Dutch vessel came carrying 20 Negroes and arrived at a place called Jamestown. Why they came, we still don't know. Historians are still arguing that point back and forth. But we do know that white so-called colonists' attempts to use Native American labor for their agricultural development, we know that that was unsuccessful. We know that was unsuccessful, and it resulted in wars, and this is important, resulted in wars that the colonists lost as early as 1622. And so as Native American free labor gave way to white indentured servitude, and then to African slavery, the society developed more laws and more edicts that then enshrined slavery into our early white colonist mindsets, leading one minister to proclaim in 1757 that to live in Virginia without slaves is morally impossible. But keep this in mind. These darker pigmented brothers and sisters from a continent afar still yet knew what they wanted. And even by 1667, where chattel slavery was in full force, this land was not yet a country, but it was a land where slaves were fed mere hominy in between hours of brutal misery from dawn to dusk. And this was a system not merely a southern phenomenon. No, from Newbury, Massachusetts to Hartford, Connecticut to Hackensack, New Jersey, Black slaves were long known to cry out for their wants. Crying, what do we want? What do we want? And they set fire to barns and ships and buildings, and they were known as revolters. They're known as revolters in each of their wants, and they were labeled Negro conspirators by papers and by white writers of the day. And perhaps such a label was merited because blacks did in fact conspire. They conspired with Native Americans and others who were forced into labor by white settlers in places like Newton, Long Island, and New York in 1712. And meanwhile, these Africans were chastised as inhibiting what they were known to do by whites as inciting immoral forms of resistance and unlawful acts of murder. And so despite the tenor of the nation at this time as an enforcer of evil, as a promoter of injustice, blacks still knew what they wanted. We resisted bondage. We fought against shackles. We redefined what it was to be considered moral. And in so doing, we began to slowly work with white sympathizers to begin the long road to acquiring what we wanted. But we dared not share with whites the query of what it is we wanted, because we knew that the answer would surely be a death sentence. So we kept that to ourselves, and yet the world knew, the Christian leadership at the time knew, the slave masters knew. And despite the robbing of names and language and culture and tradition and shelter and food and death, blacks knew too. And so began the era of abolition that led to the slow emancipation of black people by the reluctant Lincoln, only being forced to do so by a cadre of abolitionist movement heroes and sheroes who had worked tirelessly in the decades prior. And so a plan that Lincoln had to colonize us became a proclamation to set us free. A plan to send us back to Africa became an amendment to the Constitution granting us citizenship and equal protection. A plan to let the slavery question somehow solve itself became a plan to give black men the right to vote, and all blacks the right to federal protection in the form of troops and economic assistance in the form of a bureau, and political rights and the images of leaders such as Blanche Bruce and John Mercer Langston and Hiram Revels and a host of others. And yet, blacks long fought to get the answer to the question, what do we want? And so, with the help of white radical Republicans, we sought to enshrine the answer to the question into Civil War amendments, Civil Rights Acts throughout the 1800s, and policy advancements throughout southern states. But the question of what do we want suffered attempted assassination in 1876 with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. It suffered attempted assassination with the development of a system named after a black minstrel show called Jim Crow. It suffered attempted assassination as a result of Plessy v. Ferguson and the development of domestic terrorism and the acts of hoods, white sheets, and burned crosses. The question of what do we want was on life support as a result of an instrument made of nylon, polyester, and polypropylene called a noose. And yet the question of what we wanted did not die. Though many died seeking to show the world the validity of an answer to such a question, the question did not die. Though the Supreme Court nullified congressional acts granting freedoms and rights to participate in American society as full citizens to blacks, the question did not die. As the songs of comfort moved from ain't none of that good news to keep your hands on the plow till you better leave segregation alone to we shall overcome, the question did not die. As the world's most powerful figure shifted from a slave-owning federalist to a racist anti-federalist, to a reluctant Republican sympathizer, to a racist segregationist, to a northern liberal, to a southern master of the Senate, the question still did not die. As the rights afforded blacks shifted from, quote, none a white man was bound to respect, to separate but equal, to all deliberate speed, the question did not die. From the stone of hope to keep hope alive to the audacity of hope, the question did not die. No, now the question yet remains, what do we want? What do we want, really? What is it that we want? In speaking to a New England audience, the escaped slave, a man with a bounty on his head, the freedom chaser, Frederick Douglass, dared explain what it is that blacks actually wanted. And he dared to tell the white audience why. He said, quote, we may be asked, I say, why we want it. I will tell you why we want it, Douglas says. We want it because it is our right, first of all. No class of men can, without insulting their own nature, be content with any deprivation of their rights. He goes on to say, we want it again as a means for educating our race. But what is it that we actually want? The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. answered this question in a speech called I Have a Dream. This speech was delivered right down 94 here in the Detroit area, with powerful imagery well before the March on Washington, of which we celebrate the 50th anniversary later this year. We should also be celebrating, though, in June, the 50th anniversary of the original I Have a Dream speech, a speech where Dr. King did in fact answer the question, what do we want? The question asked by Africans brought to unfamiliar land as laborers and later as slaves in the 16th and 17th centuries. The question that was asked by slaves seeking rights, like Dred Scott. The question that was asked by rail travelers seeking passage, such as Homer Plessy. The question that was asked by countless others in the experience of the African American tradition. Dr. King replied to the ancestors right near here in Detroit. He said, quote, we want all of our rights, we want them here, and we want them now. He said, God is not interested in the freedom of black men, brown men, and yellow men. No, God is interested in the freedom of the whole human race. You see, the question of what black people want benefits all of us. Think of it as triple up economics. And so the question of what do we want, what do we really want, is in fact answered. It's answered by Dr. King when he says that we want all of our rights, we want them here, and we want them now. And I might add, we want them with your help. As Frederick Douglass says in 1865, he says, quote, I ask my friends who are apologizing for not insisting upon this right. Where can a black man look in this country for the assertion of his right if he may not look to the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society? And today we ask the same question of a man who shared dreams of his father. We ask this question of a man who dared us to hope audaciously. We ask the same question of a man who asked us to believe in change. We ask the question of a man who has recalled that one of his favorite tasks is hosting town hall meetings. Meetings where he recounts in the audacity of hope that he would always be encouraged to, quote, please stay who you are. Please don't disappoint us. These are the very questions that we've come today to address. Has the 44th President of the United States, the African American President first, otherwise known as Michelle Obama's husband, has President Barack Obama stayed true to who he is? I'm sure some of the Obama fans in the room might be scrounging in your seats now. How could I dare ask such a question? But we're reminded that Plato too asked this question centuries ago. He admitted that, quote, I cannot get rid of such a mass of calumny all in a moment. And he continues, O men of Athens, it is the truth and the whole truth. I have concealed nothing. I have disassembled nothing. And yet I know that the plainness of speech makes them hate me. And what is their hatred but a proof that I am speaking the truth? Of course, I dare not presume hatred simply by asking a question that then calls into question the president's ability to disappoint us. But it is important to ask, as Plato does, in truth, should we ever get to see the answer that Dr. King proposed to the question asked by our ancestors, if we want to see that effectively addressed by this president, the cry of rights that we want now and that we want here. President Obama's first term, as we know, was met with very high expectations. In letters to President Obama, Michigan scholars share the hopes and dreams of hundreds of Americans and what they had for the president upon his initial election in 2008. One writer in that book laments, quote, "I find it hypocritical to dream of peace in Israel and Palestine when the United States continues to provide military aid to Israel to suppress the people who can never hope to stand up to their oppressors." End quote. Another writer pens, "Please help us put the fire out in Africa. Northern Uganda, Darfur, Zimbabwe, the Democratic Republic of Congo, all of the citizens of these nations are suffering from disease and malnutrition and violence." Still another missive states with confidence, quote, "I know you being the president, our futures are going to be better, and our education is going to improve. I know that you are going to stop the war, and I know that you're going to save all that money to help people that really need it." Yet another letter pleads to the president, "Don't turn this country into a socialist nation. The worst thing to happen in the world is a Marxist movement." And there were other requests, from reforming the prison system to solving climate change to giving homeless people a safe home and some money. Our hopes and dreams were truly planted at the gate of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in November of 2008. But where are they now? Where are they now? Just last week, the president of the National Association of Advancement of Colored People, Ben Jealous, remarked that, quote, "The country's back to pretty much where it was when this president started. White people in this country are doing a bit better. Black people are doing far worse." Black unemployment was 12.7% when President Obama took office, and as of last month, is over 14%. Black youth unemployment is over 30%. Black LGBT unemployment is over 40%. The black median income has fallen 11%. And just before the president was elected in 2009, data from 2005 to 2009 indicates that while a typical white household had the net worth in 2009 of $113,000, the typical net worth for African Americans was $5,677. And that also has gotten worse. Minority home ownership has declined. And yes, that is in part because of subprime mortgages, but regression as opposed to progression nonetheless. The number of black-owned businesses declined. 28% of African Americans and 37% of black children are poor, compared with 10% of whites and 13% of white children. Is that what we want from this nation? Is that what we want for this nation? So at least it should be clear that on the economic front, the question still remains, what do we want? Well, it seems that blacks still want the president who presided over these historic declines. We clearly re-elected President Obama. By we, I do mean African Americans. And I know that might be shocking to some of you. So I'm going to explain it. And then I'm going to first, though, revisit some numbers from the past election. President Obama became the first Democrat since FDR to win a majority in the popular vote in consecutive elections. And the first Northern Democrat, although he was born in Hawaii, but since he calls Chicago home, we will call him as a Northern Democrat, the first Northern Democrat to be re-elected since FDR, earning nearly 51% of the vote to Governor Romney's ironically, 47%. The margin of victory was 4.65 million votes. In the Electoral College, his victory appears to have been even more dramatic. He won 332 electoral votes to 206 for Governor Romney. In terms of total turnout, there were 131 million votes cast in 2008, and there were 128 million votes cast in 2012, a decline of 2.3%. And while in swing states, the total vote count increased significantly, it decreased in other states. Only 54.8% of voters turned out in non-swing states, compared to 62.7% in swing states. Black turnout was down from 2008 slightly, but in Ohio, my home state of Ohio, the state that carried the president over the finish line, the black share of the vote increased significantly. It was also strong in other swing states, Florida, right here in Michigan, Missouri, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. And the president won a majority of those states also in the Electoral College. That's why I indicated earlier, and perhaps to your surprise, that African Americans were a significant factor in his re-election. Whereas Obama received 93% of the black vote, down from 2% in 2008, the share, 13%, stayed the same. And blacks cast nearly 17 million votes out of 129 million, compared to a little over 17 million out of 131 million in 2008. Hence, the decrease from 2008 to 2012 was about 2.46%, or 420,000 votes. With 26.6 million voting age eligible black adults, and with 16.68 million votes cast, that means that black turnout was roughly 63%, 62.7%. And that was below the record of 64.7%, nearly 65% of turnout of African Americans in 2008. However, black women represented 62% nearly of Obama's share of the black vote, whereas he received only about 38% of the share of the vote among black men. And significantly, Hispanic or Latino brothers and sisters increased their share of the vote from 8% in 2008 to 10%, first time reaching double digits just last November. Meanwhile, the total share of the vote among whites declined to 72%, the lowest in history. The black vote was key in many states. And you can't really see it here, but pay attention to states, the ones I referenced earlier, like Florida, Michigan, North Carolina. You can see them here, roughly around there, and pay attention to these numbers in the middle section of the column. You can focus on those briefly for a moment. The black vote was key in many states, but only some of them did exit polling. And so we only really have the black share of the vote for those states that did exit polling. And some of those states were here in the Midwest, including Ohio and Michigan. And so if you pay attention to Ohio and Michigan, in Ohio, the black share of the vote increased by 36% from 2008 to 2012. The largest of any population in the country. And here in Michigan, it increased 33%. That means 33% more black people voted for President Obama in the state of Michigan last November than they did in 2008. Meanwhile, both states experienced declines in total votes, in Ohio by 2.2%, in Michigan by 5.4%. Essentially, white voters did not turn out. In all, the states where black voters represented important contributions to his victory are Florida, where blacks comprise 24% of the vote, Michigan, 28%, Ohio, 28%, Pennsylvania, 23%, Virginia, 36%. Clearly, blacks were key to the president winning those states. In terms of black partisanship voting, Romney tied the second lowest percentage of the black vote received by a Republican nominee, tying with the infamous Barry Goldwater from 1964. And we know that presidential candidate Senator John McCain received the lowest in history with 4% in 2008. 96% of black women voted for President Obama. 87% of black men did. Nationally, the black contribution to the president's total popular vote in 2012 was 24.1%. Slightly more than 23.5% in 2008. Black women comprised 8% of the electorate, black men 5%. Black women were a larger share of their electorate than black men. And as a result, their share of the president's vote total was roughly 15%, which is higher than black men. But we have to understand that the numbers for African American men perhaps would be higher if it weren't for the fact that nearly 1.5 million of voting age black men, more than 1 in 8, are ineligible to cast ballots because of state laws that strip felons of the right to vote. Meanwhile, Obama received 39% of the white vote. But because white voters were only 72% of the electorate, President Obama was able to win. Had that largely been any other candidate who did not receive significant minority support, they would have lost significantly. The president did win the majority of the white vote, however, in New England, the Pacific Northwest, and Iowa. He received nearly 50% of the vote in states like New York and Wisconsin and Minnesota. In the Deep South, however, he barely made it double digits. 10% of the white vote he received in Mississippi, 15% in Alabama, and also the white vote declined in states like Florida and Virginia, although only slightly. In all, blacks voted at a higher rate in 2012 than other minority groups. And for the first time in history, this is so important, for the first time in history, blacks may have also voted at a higher rate than whites. We won't know for sure until a few months when the census publishes its biannual post-election survey on voter turnout, but for now, we have somewhat conclusive evidence that black electoral power that we saw from November 2012 was not the result of demographic change, but because of rising turnout rates. Given the history of the vote that has been denied to people of color and the recent history of voter ID laws in several states, the fact that blacks pulled off this feat is absolutely remarkable. Hence, blacks are said to have actually overperformed, given their 12% of the population, yet 13% of the national voting turnout rates. This helped President Obama to win 80% of the non-white vote. 80% of the non-white vote, including 73% of Asian Americans, 71% of Latinos. How did President Obama do it? Yes, demographics, but also because of turnout increases. Growth in populations in the Asian and Hispanic or Latino communities, and increased participation rates among blacks from 2000 to 2012 had a significant impact on the president's re-election. Historically and most significantly, again, blacks may have achieved an historic turnout milestone, made only possible because of the passage of the Voting Rights Act from 1965. And they did so in the face of systemic Republican-led efforts to suppress the vote. And we may soon, again, be able to conclusively say that black turnout in this country surpassed the turnout of Caucasian Americans. We already know that it did in 2008 in terms of black youth vis-a-vis white youth. But the reality that this story is moving beyond the 1829 group to all African Americans shows significant strength through significant turmoil. The results, well, according to Gallup, of course, which is a leading national polling organization, other than party identification and ideology, the American electorate now is more divided by race and ethnicity than by any other variable. Even though Republicans were more enthusiastic about voting last year, they were more enthusiastic than Democrats, Obama still wins, which suggests that the sampling perhaps of African American voters in Gallup polls is not yet high enough. Thus, in general, polling science, we've all seen polls where it says Americans think X, Americans believe Y. Polling science was validated with President Obama's win. So much so that the self-made king of poll aggregation predictive science, a gentleman by the name of Nate Silver, was also vindicated. But now, the election is over, and the president still occupies the White House, and black unemployment is still over 14%. It's even higher for members of the youth and LGBT black communities. There's still yet a host of other dismal statistics that indicate that blacks are yet falling behind whites when it comes to socioeconomic mobility. So what now? As Dr. King asked, where do we go from here? The first term saw historic, symbolic, and substantive accomplishments. Most in the first year, including major reforms to the student loan program, providing for direct loans from the government, reforms in children's health insurance, internet access, the credit card holders' Bill of Rights, various stimulus programs, and of course, the Affordable Health Care Act. Respective to women and LGBT Americans, just as an example, the president held the first ever LGBT Pride Month events, recognized the first ever Transgender Day of Remembrance, and his administration hosted and continued to host several LGBT policy briefings nationwide at all levels of federal government. Moreover, the president has enacted several administrative policies and some laws, though the vast majority of changes can yet be altered by a new occupant in the White House who simply does not share his views with the stroke of a pen. And what about his own views, at least as it comes to helping African Americans? Well, to date, the president has appointed no new African Americans to high-level cabinet posts in his second term. And when asked about the high black unemployment, he's replied in the past, quote, "The only thing I cannot do is by law. I can't pass laws that say I'm just helping black folks. I'm president of the United States." This approach, of course, has some scholars labeling him as an example of ethnic avoidance. But they do so despite the president's significant rhetorical record on addressing needs in the black community. So, it's been demonstrated in many American political contexts that the theory of shared racial experience creates a stronger sense of expectation and results when blacks finally see one of their own in a powerful political position. But does that mean we should expect public and consistent and persistent attention to issues facing the black community? Many scholars have argued just that. They have implied the president did not deserve the 93% of the black vote he received last November. And it is true that the president's re-election and corresponding first-term record has yet resulted in many concerns from the black community regarding attentiveness to their concerns. But much of this plight is the result of conservative social policies of Democratic and Republican administrations post the 1960s. And without offering solutions to the balancing act of the president's duality of being a black president and a president who happens to be black, scholars and pundits fall short when they de-emphasize the significance of the president's record on race, at least when it comes to rhetoric. And so President Obama has actually talked more about race than any other president in recent history. For example, at the signing of the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Restoration Act, the president said, quote, "It's the story of women across this country still earning just 78 cents for every dollar men earn. Women of color, even less. President Obama replied to a question addressing a healthcare reform and the impact that would have on minority communities at a White House forum, and he said this: "It's pretty indisputable that even when you account for incomes and levels of insurance, that you're still seeing problems in the African American community. In terms of quality of care and outcomes, and part of what we should be doing is thinking about, based on this evidence and this data, there are ways that we can close the gap. And to the extent that that is reflected in this reform, I think that that will ultimately save everybody some money." And there's another example about his rhetoric. He says there's a long history in this country of African Americans and Latinos being stopped by law enforcement disproportionately. That's just a fact. These are things that the president has said that has directly referenced race and people of color that we have frankly never heard from the mouth of a president before. And yet we want more. We want more because, think about it, when we've been asked in post-election interviews, many blacks nationwide expressed an idea that they believe the president will somehow more aggressively advocate for black interests and that he now doesn't have to worry about re-election, so that's a fair expectation for us to have. And so now Obama is faced with another set of expectations. But this time, it's not based on hope and change, but it's based on policy introduction and programmatic development. This time, blacks and all Americans are no longer merely celebrating the creation of an Office of Urban Affairs, for example, but we're asking, what is that office actually doing for urban communities? This time, blacks and all Americans we're no longer merely applauding the development of national economic policies that are said to benefit blacks too somehow, but we are asking, when will I get the call that says I'm hired? This time, Americans are no longer cheering the expansion of community college affordability and access to higher education. No, this time, Americans are asking, how can I enroll? The president has a host of emerging political issues to contend with. And as the letters described earlier attest, there are many different dreams that each American has and that they want realized, and they hope the president can do it. And so on top of everyday macro problems that do require significant attention, the president in his second term has got to find resources and the time to build the legislative agenda to advance the black community, and thereby, again, triple up economics, all of us. Just as many mayors have throughout the nation, as I've explored in some of my work, the president, now that he has been reelected and has been reelected on the shoulders of African Americans and all people in this country, we have an opportunity now to demand more engagement from the president. But we cannot sit back and wait for our leaders to do so. Check this out, and I'm almost done here. I read the other day that the announcement of yet another black agenda was being formed, and that the black community so-called leaders who happen to lead national organizations that speak to me and the concerns of the community were forming this agenda in hopes of presenting it to the White House. However, what's concerning about this so-called agenda is that it's not inclusive of everyone. It does include the people, as the president said in his own inaugural, people who marched from and through Seneca Falls to Selma and to Stonewall. No, this so-called black agenda and development by these leaders doesn't include many issues that I did not have time to adequately talk about today. Issues like health disparities on today, the National Black HIV and AIDS Awareness Day. Issues about educational attainment, LGBT inclusion, youth development, and so much more. It begs the question then, what in fact really is a leader? Therefore, so I suggest, while we're here to talk about the president and his record from the first term and our expectations and hopes for the second, as it is Black History Month, we must now also edify the nation's vote from last November. It's not enough to expect the president, black or otherwise, to realize the needs and interests of African Americans and all Americans. No, we must do as A. Philip Randolph and organize a union to protect our rights if need be. We've got to do as Bayard Rustin and organize and lead a march to show thousands throughout the world, as Seeley did, that we are in fact here. We must do as Melba and Diane and Ernest and Julian and Thelma and seek inclusion in the midst of national confusion. For there is much work left for us to do, and this president, every president, needs our help. And we can begin, I suggest, by not creating some separate agenda that will inevitably leave somebody out and create more factions. But rather, we should try our hardest to work in unison to get on the agenda that already exists. The agenda that exists in our towns, on our jobs, in our state capitals, and in DC. And we've got to do this because the power structure of American government, from the first representative structure built in 1619 in Virginia to the branches of government that are enshrined in our Constitution, the basic structure remains the same and it remains uniquely American. This government in this country works for and by the people. You and me. President Obama knows this, but we've got to remind the next president as well. She must be reminded too. And we've got to remind them by increasing our level of participation to even higher levels. We can remind them by helping the administration move their advancements in administrative policy regarding the interests of Americans to legalize legislation and, in fact, law, so that those interests remain supported no matter the occupant of the White House. And therefore, we can remind them by not just focusing on the presidential election every year, but we've got to pay attention to state and local elections. State elected officials decide what congressional districts look like. It is state elected officials who change how states can be apportioned electoral college votes in the presidential election. It's our local elected officials who accept and distribute federal dollars from HUD for community development block grant programs. Local and state elected officials are concerned about and seek to represent Black interests and all of our interests, and they are the ones who enact local laws that are supposed to mirror those at the federal level. We, in fact, are a representative republic. We're not just a mere democracy. And as such, we have to do, as citizens in the voting booth, take our job seriously. We have to be concerned about who we send to Lansing. We have to be concerned about who we send to other capitals across the country. It matters for school funding, for those of you who are struggling to pay for your education. It matters for civil rights enforcement. It matters for marriage rights and employment rights. It matters for effective governance. And it matters for President Obama. And my last point is, point to national disasters for evidence, if you don't believe me. In nearly every instance where there is a disaster and the federal, state, and local government work together, help is as seamless as possible in such a situation. But we all know what happens when it's not. Just pay attention to Katrina. Or more recently, look at Sandy. And our own political destinies, I argue, our own destinies are similar. So the question that was asked long ago, what do we want, has in fact been answered by Dr. King, where he said, we want our rights here and we want them now. And so I encourage you to please go out in your communities and insist on being put on the agenda. You can in fact write the White House. You can sign a petition. You can engage in local affairs to ensure that your voice is heard. And only then, only if we do that, will the president's second term and therefore his presidency be assured of not being a hollow hope, but a tangible hope. A hope with a real impact, a substantive hope, and dare I say an audacious one. Let us, through our collective organizing, let us remind the president in his second term of the town halls that he claims he likes so much, where we as citizens get to ask him, please, don't change who you truly are. Please, Mr. President, don't disappoint us. Thank you so much.